Is that it?
You don't do Microsoft? Oh, yeah, that's your, you got it.
There we
Okay.
go. Okay, cool. This is the title of the talk, but the main point that I want to come across with today is for y'all to have a general understanding of how plants were being used for food by hunter-gatherers living here in Central Texas 1,000 years ago. So this has been basically the main thrust of my work for about a decade, basically trying to reconstruct the material lifeways of indigenous peoples of the area where I grew up, Central Texas. I'm from Austin. So a big component of that is the uses of wild foods for or wild plants for food. Obviously, they're all going to be native plants. And one big reason I do this is to motivate conservation. The number one supporters of conservation are hunters, both financially and politically. And I think if there was a system of licensure and permitting and regulations that we could do the same thing with foraging. And just at a deeper level, I think if people appreciate the plants around them, they're not just a plant. It has many uses. It's a source of life for food, medicine, material, that would motivate the average person to care about nature more. So I'm going to start out with just some general intro stuff about how I came to learn this, and then a general overview of the types of food uses of plants, and then spend probably most of the time on about 18 different taxa. I've chosen the most prominent and familiar taxa that and their uses for food by indigenous peoples. Let's see where. Oh, this is just the cover of my book. I don't know. This is all my media is just from my book. Um, so you can see I got a bunch of plants there. I have a raid in front that I've collected. So yeah, I've spent the past decade or so trying to piece together the material lifeways, mainly the food uses, and I also cover medicine and material uses, but the food has been a big part of it. The main ways I've been doing this is research and experimentation in the field. So as Mike was saying, I went to Berkeley. I went to grad school there, and I was studying ethnobotany in depth and ethnobiology because I found that in the libraries there, they have so many references at a it's really unique period of time where we have anthropologists meeting hunter-gatherers in North America. California is one of the last states to be colonized, and so you have this little sweet spot where there's some really good research done on how peoples were actually living for thousands of years or very close to those times. And that was really eye-opening for me because Texas doesn't really have that. Now, part of my research does include all the early expedition accounts, like Spanish expeditions, and everything that I can get my hands on about how indigenous peoples were living in early days of contact. But, we don't even know who the native peoples were living, who they were that lived here in Central Texas before contact. I mean, you may have heard Comanche or Tonkawa. Tonkawa is an ethno-linguistic group that kind of uh, came together after contact. Comanche also just came down in like the 1700s. Even the Lipan Apache, which are in Southwest Texas, they only arrived in Texas maybe a few hundred years before contact. So besides a few archaeological studies, very little is known about this. So when I was reading all these ethnographies, I found that they discussed a lot of plants that occur in Texas. I recognize the genera is occurring in Texas, in a lot of cases, even the species. And so it clicked for me. I can basically reconstruct material lifeways by sort of surveying all of these ethnographies or just any account that I can find is discussing traditional uses of plants by indigenous cultures throughout North America. Yeah.
Also, lifestyle that you're able to find in those and get some information from those.
There are a lot of traditions that are still kept, of course, and especially I find more herbalism and the more prominent food sources. But I have not personally done any sort of like the ethnographic work myself. My main purpose has been to review all of the publications out there because there is a huge amount of them. So I haven't done any ethnobotanical field work personally, but that is an avenue that I'd like to pursue. There's definitely some missing knowledge that I'd love to piece together in the future. So, yeah, that's what I've been doing is just sort of piecing it all together, just sort of kind of reconstruct how plants in Texas were most likely being used by pre-contact peoples here. And a lot of that has been just experimenting in the field. It's complemented my by my abilities of primitive skills, like just sort of replicating stuff with Stone Age technology only. So I've had a lot of fun over the years doing that. Also a lot of work. So mainly the research and the field practice. Here's another picture of just an assortment of different foraged things I have. This is all just kind of a snapshot in time of things that I just had foraged one summer and stored. A lot of the stuff is dry, but I'll cover probably most of these as the taxa that I'll be covering. Oh, so here is the probably the best construction of indigenous peoples of Texas that I can come up with. But of course, in the past 500 years, there's been so much cultural change that a lot of these peoples aren't really original to this area, like the Tonkawa. Like I said, they're kind of a convalescence of various tribes and leap on a patch of new arrivals. The Karankawa were definitely here at contact, and these are a lot of sub-tribes of the Karankawa. I've pieced this together from a whole bunch of different references, but it's still not complete. And as you can see, there's not really a lot in the central Texas area. These are all sort of Tecan allied tribes, which there's a lot of those still around. I mean, most of these are still members around, but this area in particular is a little bit sparse about what we know of. But that's the best construction that I have. And this is my sort of a conception of Central Texas. So if you're wondering what I'm talking about when I say Central Texas, some people think of this as Central Texas, but as far as like ecoregions and just various convenience, this is just what I've defined, somewhat arbitrarily, of course, as Central Texas is that big circle in the middle. And so Austin and Travis counties kind of being the far edge of it. So this is the general categories of plant food use that I was referring to earlier. I should bring up, I have like speech notes that I forgot I was supposed to even consult. What was I guess it's already on here anyway, but it's not showing the top here. Oops. Anyway, the top just says Paleolithic plant foods. So not really an order of importance here, but a big category is small seeds and grains. So examples of species used for that include many in the Amaranthus genus, Chenopodium genus. I don't know how to see the other one, something else written there, but Cirsium, Helianthus, Ivas, Solidago, Verbena. So you can read that. But nuts are a huge category. Plant use extremely important, and those are mainly going to be pecan. But there's some other hickories in other areas of Texas, especially East Texas. We also have Caryota texana, I think it is in here, but that's pretty rare. The main one would be pecan, and then a few species of walnuts. Kind of special here. We have three species. Mesquite, probably the most important wild plant food in the area. Definitely, if we're talking about just the Southwest in general, honey mesquite is the number one source of nutrition as far as plant foods, in many areas constituting like half of the calories consumed. And this is kind of distinct from acorns, which, if I were to say what's the most important plant food for indigenous North Americans in general, I would say acorns. But that's kind of replaced in the Southwest with mesquite. Mesquite has a huge advantage of you don't need to process the acorns, you don't need to process the mesquite pods to make them edible as you have to do for the acorns, which otherwise have bitter tannins you have to leach out. But I'll cover that more in depth later. Sorry? Yeah, most of them. I haven't really gotten so much into the seeds and grains ones. A few of these, they're just in my research. So all of these are just plants that I found in my research that were eaten by indigenous peoples. And as I put it together, as far as what's important for them. But I've eaten, I would say, almost all of them. The main category, which there's a few, like I haven't tried the goldenrod seeds or the verbena seeds or uh, the Iva. Actually, I haven't tried that one either. But yeah, pretty much everything else I've tried. No, some of the gum ones I haven't tried. Some of them I'm confused on how they even could be gum. But yeah, most of them. Big category also. This is a fun one also just for people who are interested in foraging. If y'all are interested in trying some of these out, fleshy fruits are a very beginner friendly, approachable category here. And we have a ton of species. You can see the ones in bold. I don't know if y'all can see that, but the ones in bold I'll be covering later on in the specific taxa accounts. Then dry fruits and beans, that kind of is just a catch-all category for things that don't really fit in other ones. But Palo Verde is actually a great one of those, incredibly delicious. I call it the wild edamame tree. I think I'll cover that specifically. I may have taken that one out though. And then greens and shoots, those are a big category, especially in the early spring. Right now, we have tons of greens and shoots available. Amaranths, again, is going to be a big component of that. Chenopodium. There's a lot of things I have listed there. I won't list them for you, but the bulbs, corms, rhizomes, and tubers, geophytes, things that grow in the ground, have a lot of carbohydrates. That's a really important category, especially as if you go up to the plains. They probably weren't a huge category here, but in more plains habitat, which actually there used to be a little bit more open space, so maybe they were a little bit more important than now. But one of those that's really interesting is what's it, Camas. So I don't did I even put that one in here? I don't even put that one. But there is a Camas species. It's very uncommon now, but probably was historically much more common when you have more open prairie, savanna-like habitat with more burning and bison and everything. What else? Bark, sap, and sugars. That's an interesting one where a lot of it is like the inner bark or possibly tapping for sap. You can tap box elder for sap, just like maples in the maple genus, and many natives such as the Kiowa did that with it. Juniper inner bark, not very good, but maybe like a famine food. But you can also get the sap and sugars. A lot of these honeydew is aphid frass, so that's actually one of the only sources of sugar that was being used by indigenous peoples in North America. There was no native honeybee. Well, there probably was no native honeybee. It could have been extirpated or killed off by the introduced European honeybee before it was even recorded by science. That I found a reference once referring to that before 1620 when the European honeybee was introduced. Anyway, the honeydew leaves its frass on its secretions, which is just like sugary secretions on plants like the cottonwood leaf or on reeds. And that was dried and beaten and beaten over like a buckskin to get that sweet material and isolate it as like a sugar. Yeah.
Are any of these plants farmed by the native people or just together?
So in Central Texas, we don't think that there was any agriculture. There's no evidence for there being any agriculture at all. But if I'm to speculate, based on many other hunter-gatherers, such as in California, it's possible that they were doing some sort of tending or some, I don't know the term for it, but just proto-agriculture, maybe, especially of things like tobacco. So tobacco, a very common feature we find in hunter-gatherers is it being maybe planted, at least weeded. There's definitely some certain spots that were being used to grow tobacco, and although it wasn't like intensively managed or necessarily even planted, there was some sort of care going on. And that sort of tending of the wild is a broader concept that is seen throughout a lot of indigenous cultures in North America, where, burning just in general is not just to clear the land to be able to hunt deer easier. It also helped for the acorn harvest. For example, it allows you to pick up the acorns easier, but it also kills off the acorn weevils, crops on the ground, to prevent them from reinfesting the new crop. And a lot of coppicing, harrowing, a lot of pruning and weeding, all those sorts of things were practiced very commonly by indigenous peoples of North America in order to improve the harvests of the plants upon which they depended for their lives. So not necessarily agriculture, and definitely not like the traditional corns, beans, and squash. Even the Caddo, who were well known for their agriculture, they didn't really start agriculture until right around that time period, about 1,000 years ago. And they were part of that Mississippian culture that was very agriculture intensive. So besides the Caddo, pretty much everything westward of that, up until you get to the southwestern cultures, west of West Texas, essentially, do you find agriculture picking up again? Another possibility for agriculture that was not food would be the bottle gourd. A lot of places, surprisingly, that was the first crop that was grown, was the bottle gourd or container. Actually, the buffalo gourd has been used as a container as well, our native buffalo gourd species. So what else? Flowers and pollen, mostly insubstantial, but cattail pollen, you can actually gather a huge amount of that. It's very a good return on your calories gain for calories expended. Agave, sotol, and yucca are a huge, huge category of foods in the Southwest. So they're kind of just barely getting that over here. We obviously have those species, not so much the agave, but we have the sotol and the yucca. The yucca is probably the worst for the food uses of those asparaginous plants, but I'll cover that in depth later. Mushrooms. it's pretty dry here. I would consider mushrooms to be a rather insignificant category of food use. Maybe some oyster mushrooms or puffballs were being eaten historically. Who knows? Lichens, probably not at all. Beverages, that's a fun one. Mesquite actually was one of the biggest ways it was consumed is as a beverage. I'll cover that. Also, I'll cover most of these as sumac and yopon. These are all very interesting and a lot of aromatics. I've been working a lot on actually tea plants recently, so maybe I'll cover some of those. Seed meal made into a beverage and fruits, dried fruits were a common feature and made into beverage. In your seasoning category that a lot of people don't think about, of course, Native people season their food. Salt, where are they getting the salt from? There's a question I get a lot. A lot of people are very interested in that. And the answer is, well, I don't know. Maybe they didn't gather salt at all. There's actually plenty of evidence that a lot of natives throughout North America did not consume salt in their diet because they had enough, I suppose, just through the animal foods. Now, there is La Sal del Rey in South Texas, a big salt lake. Perhaps they're gaining it by trade. Obviously, you have natives along the coast who are capable of gathering salt, but they probably weren't like boiling it or doing any sort of intensive processing to concentrate it like we think of nowadays. There is the inland salt grass, Disticus spicata. You can gather salt from that either just by chopping up the plant and dissolving it or drying it and getting the secretions from the outside of the plant. So that's a coast marsh plant that secretes salt essentially. And salt bush is similar to that. It's like a desert plant. These other ones are just kind of seasoning, sagebrush, Artemisia luteolana will be the main one. Chiltepin, super delicious. I don't know if y'all had that. Chili piquin is another name for that. I'll cover that in depth, but there's some mustard species and they're native. Bergamot, I'd put that as more Monarda citriota or lemon bee balm would be our native species of bergamot and milkweed, gumweed, and some fruits. Gum. Chewing gum is actually a huge category of food use, just very common. Obviously, not you're going to get a lot of nutrition out of that, but that's just a feature you see a lot of indigenous cultures. Gum is going to be the number one of all of those. If you find some sap on a gum plant that's dried, try chewing it. It actually makes an amazing gum. Famine foods, these are things that probably were last resort. So I'll point out the mesquite one, the related mesquite seeds. A lot of people think that you eat the beans. You don't eat the beans. I'll just say that right away. But yeah, those are the other ones. And then agriculture, I think I already covered that basically. There wasn't really any agriculture except possibly tobacco, but and then I also covered salt basically as part of the seasonings. But yeah, some clay was being used for plant processing. Because basically I wrote about this in reference to the mesquite bean pod processing, where we would basically make plant compounds less bitter. So mesquite beans can be a little bit bitter sometimes. Clay was added to that, and that was similarly done with a lot of different food products, essentially all to reduce bitterness, like some wild potato, Solanum gymnaceae. That one is often eaten by the Hopi, for example, with some a particular type of clay in order to reduce the bitterness, and some ashes of plants can also serve as kind of a salt substitute. Or ashes actually also used to like process acorn meal to make it to leach the tannins, basically a lye solution, boiling the kernels with some wood ash. And then water, most of the springs. We have so many springs in this area that's obviously going to be the number one source. But the water bodies are also pretty much clean to drink, and you can obtain water from cacti and agave, like the barrel cactus. But that wasn't likely that important in this area. It's just an interesting aside for the desert natives. Okay, so these are the main categories. Let me go over the main taxa. So there's 18 of them here, and I've just sort of chosen them based on what I think is going to be some of the most important or most useful and relatable for y'all. My book covers like 120 different species, so these are just the main one. And you'll see some of them are actually, well, there's one whole family, but then there's others genera, and then some are just specific species, or even you have a variety for Chiltepin. So starting out with the first one, which you couldn't see in that first slide, which is the Amarantaceae. So this again isn't really an order of importance or anything. It's just random kind of. But this would be really important for greens and seeds. So this is Amaranthus palmeri being shown. Super nutritious. So in the amaranth family, the main ones you have that I'm going to talk about is Amaranthus genus, the amaranths or pigweed, and Chenopodium or the goosefoot or what's another name for them? Yeah, mainly just goosefoot or chenopodium. So Amaranthus palmeri is shown. You can see the flowering stalks there, which produce tons of the seeds. So many different amaranth species were very important food sources for natives throughout North America, especially in the Southwest, I would say, and especially for seeds. Although the greens of them are all edible and all super nutritious, extremely high in protein. What else do we have here? I have some this red ant. So the introduced versus native status, a lot of these amaranth species is a little bit confusing because a lot of them were kind of either cultivated or semi-cultivated. They definitely are kind of in that zone where it's like some of them were just kind of let to grow, and this is seen in even modern Hopi culture where they'll let amaranth plants volunteer and just sort of tend them sometimes. So it's kind of hard to figure out where a lot of these are from. Amaranthus cruentus is the top red one, and Blatoides is the lower one. And here I have a more in-depth. Wow, y'all can't see that at all, but it's not that important. In my research, I also include all the
Well, let
indigenous
him
names for
talk, let him
plants
look
that I
at
can
it and
find in my
say,
research, and a lot of times they're really
you
interesting. They'll
know,
say something
if it's your guy could
about the
smell
plant
it,
that
he
you might
may
not
not have
think
smelled
of
it
something
originally.
descriptive
You're
or something about
sensitive
how it's
to this.
used. For example, this red amaranth is used as a face paint, and its Zuni name is red face paint. And that was also used as a dye by the Hopi to dye bread. But so we have prostate pigweed and what is that? Amaranthus blatoides? Oh no, that's I can't see the top part of it. I've forgotten. Matte amaranth. Is there a way to make this full screen or something, or
Ink,
those little notifications?
if you, and you can probably put in a number, and you can't see, can you? Like, uh, so just change, highlight it and, ooh, that's too big. Is that
Okay, thank
big
you.
enough? Like, and you can close.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, albus is that top one. Yeah, the and as you can see, there's a bunch of different species in the area of amaranth, but Palmer's amaranth, Amaranthus palmeri is the most common. And obviously, a lot
You
of them
getting a putty?
for names. In my research, I always put the name of the tribe, which ate
You
that.
okay?
Okay,
Is there going
now
to
we
involve
have
changing things?
this is
Okay.
Chenopodium
No, no.
album right here, although we have several species of Chenopodium in the area, the goosefoot, basically the same use, the seeds or the greens, and both incredibly nutritious. And the way the small seeds are gathered, which this is going to apply for any small fruit, any grain or small seeds, is you have like a receptacle basket. You have the plant right here, it's fruiting, and you put a receptacle basket underneath the plant where it's fruiting, and then you strike it with a stick or like a basketry racket, and then those ripe seeds or fruits will fall into your basket. So that was the main way indigenous people collected a bunch of small things like that. So it might be like, how do they do that? And then of course there's a process of winnowing and sorting it and cleaning it, which I'm not sure I need to go into, but basically clean off the material and isolate it. And then typically like the seeds of Chenopodium or Amaranthus would be ground into a meal and cooked in some sort of mush. So eaten pretty plain. And the greens also either eaten raw, but more often cooked, especially the older plant parts, cook, put them into a stew or something. So that's Chenopodium album. That's pretty common. And then we have Berlandieri. By the way, y'all probably heard of that name. Berlandieri is a specific epithet for a lot of plants. Jean-Louis Berlandier was the first and kind of the only guy to really go around Texas and record how natives were using plants. He was, I would consider, the first guy to do ethnobotany in Texas, and really one of the only ones. I've read all of his materials in depth, and he did a great service to Texas by recording that because I rely on his research and what he did a lot. So thank you, Jean-Louis Berlandier. And then we have Chinopodium. What's crazy about this one, I don't know if y'all have seen it, it was a very pretty one, but it's very similar to the album, but it has that pinkish tinge that's in important to the whiteness. A lot of sources disagree on whether this is introduced or native. It probably was introduced because it's kind of a very odd distribution here, where it's just kind of in Central Texas, but a lot of confliction on databases about that. Oh yeah, I think I mentioned it here. It's not really that important. We also have Chenopodium praticola in the area. Any interesting names for lamb's quarter? Oh, lamb's quarter is the other name. I couldn't think of it. Goosefoot or lamb's quarter refers to the Chenopodium genus. But I think lamb's quarter is more officially Chenopodium album. Anyway, on to pecan, which I would consider to be number two most important wild plant food for indigenous peoples pre-contact, and actually still there's is very important in indigenous cultures of Texas. There's some like pecan festivals are still held every year by Native Americans in Texas, so it's very highly regarded, and it was one of the big early industries of Texas. The settlers was being sold by wagon loads along the Guadalupe in the early colony times. So one reason for that is it produces a ton of these and they're very rich in fats. So the top left there, I have pecan oil. So each pecan kernel, the nut meat is like 80% fats, I believe. And it has another like around 10% protein, 10% carbs. So it's insanely nutritious, it's insanely calorie dense. And so I made this pecan oil because I read a lot of references about hickories being used for oil. Also, walnuts. I'll cover walnuts in a second here, but both were very commonly processed into oil. Now, pecan, it doesn't make as much sense to do that because it's the best of all the hickories. It's the only one we don't call a hickory because it's so special. It has a lot of nut meat. It's very easy to crack. It's very easy to extract the nut meat. So very simple to just get the nut meat from it. For many other species of hickory, the shells are thicker. They're more convoluted, and walnuts especially, they're a pain to crack and get that nut meat out. So often what was done was simply crush the nuts whole, shell and all, put them in a container, and then boil it. And then the oil will rise to the top. More properly, you got to strain it out, and then you have a liquid which the top fraction will separate out to be the oil. And you can skim that off, and any extra water that's contained in that you can simmer off. Or what I do is just freeze the whole container, and I could just pour the oil off cleanly. But that was a huge method of processing hickories and walnuts by natives of the eastern North America, especially, and that was used for all sorts of purposes. Any purpose you would consider to use cooking oil nowadays was used by them for that, and or as like a butter substitute, or like just an addition to many other foods, as well as for many material uses such as anointing the body, anointing the hair, uh, used for mosquito repellent, even especially the walnuts, um, and then for like curing leather or wood, just any sort of oil purpose is really good for that. So these are most likely being gathered in huge abundance and stored for like quantities that would last probably 2 years. This is a feature we see in a lot of hunter-gatherer indigenous cultures, that they would put the stores of the important foods in like a big granary, like a basketry granary that you weave and put a roof over it to protect it from the elements. And you would gather enough to save for 2 years because you never know, every other year can be bad. You want to have a hedge. So that would be number two most important food source. Also, the leaves are good for tea. I don't know if you all know that, but pecan leaf tea is amazing. So this is the walnut. We have a few walnut species in the area: Myricarpa, Juglans nigra, and Juglans major. Uh, Actually, I'm not sure if Juglans major would have been here historically. It seems kind of random that it's here. It's more of a Western species, but these were also most likely used pretty extensively. Probably not as important if you have a good pecan crop, though, but basically everything I just said about pecan applies to the use of the walnuts. Makes an excellent dye as well. The holes of pecan also uses dye. And here's the walnut species I was just covering. Yeah, the little walnut is probably the least useful, but it was being found. It was found in coprolites of Texas natives in Southwest Texas 5,000 years ago. But yeah, that eastern black walnut was a very important food source for natives around the east and here. Okay, so this is the number one wild plant food for natives of the Southwest for sure, and most likely in this area historically. So mesquite, and it's so funny how people today kind of hate on mesquite, and I can't tell you how many times I've been told that mesquite is non-native and invasive. Now, mesquite was mentioned actually by Cyrus Harp. He's actually a really good source. One of the earliest Spanish expedition account is Texas, 1528. He goes around Texas. He's kind of like a castaway and sort of a slave for some time for the natives of Texas, and he definitely mentions the natives eating mesquite, or well, he doesn't call it that, but what he describes is certainly mesquite. And so it's been in the Southwest for a million years and being used by natives of the Southwest probably for 20,000 plus years. So, yeah.
Mention a little bit about that person.
Kumesi Navaka?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Sorry. What was the last part? Oh, okay. Yeah, so I got a lot from his expedition account. It's very fascinating. He came in what's his name? Panfilo de Narvaez expedition in 1528. They basically crashed on the Galveston coast, and the expedition was very quickly whittled down to only two people, or maybe it was like two or three. Cabeza de Vaca was one of them. His name, that's his last name is Cabeza de Vaca. Um, but he and Esteban, uh, they were wandering around Texas for a few years before they finally made it back to to Mexico City, I believe, where they were able to get a ship back. But he wrote about his account and firsthand account of natives of Texas and his experience in what he called, I guess, the wilderness of the Texas. Um, and so he talks a lot about his time with presumably who were the Karankawa and the Gulf Coast, and then also he goes inland and mentions a lot of people that we don't really know who he's referring to, but he uh, mentions them processing mesquite, and he definitely is like he's like kind of a slave for a while to pick prickly pear. Um, that was a big food source for them, but yeah, he also they kind of like. Um, elect him to be like a shaman essentially because he's Christian obviously and he like prays over some sick people or some sick Indians at some point and then they get better and so he's like employed for a time as like a healer and so he's going around and like healing all these Indians and that's like how he's making his living essentially. It's a very fascinating account, and the ethnobotanical details are a little bit sparse in there, but the ones that I have found in there is kind of irreplaceable because they there's some really interesting stuff. Like he talks about the use of yopon and mesquite as well. So we have some verified, really good examples of basically at contact how natives were using plants.
Thank you.
So. Cabeza de Vaca. What's his first name? I'm blanking on his first name. Doesn't matter, but uh you'll he has the account that's I'm not sure what even the account is called, but it should be easy to find. 1528 is when it starts. Yeah.
You may not know, but I'll ask anyway. I'm gluten free and I bought mesquite flour one time. What part, do you know what part they would have used for that?
Yes. That's what I'm getting into right here. That's what the point of this is.
The husk,
This
the
is
whole of the,
it's the mesocarp. So yeah, this is a big point of contention. A lot of people misunderstand, and even now I find myself saying, "Oh, you eat mesquite beans." So could we think of them as beans? They're really bean pods. Mesquite beans properly would be this part right here. Those you don't eat. Well, you can't. I'll get into that. So the main source of food is going to be this spongy mesocarp layer. You see, I don't know if you can see it, but I have labeled it A, which is the exocarp, or the skin, a very thin skin layer. And you have right inside that mesocarp, a spongy layer that's 87% carbohydrates, super digestible, very nutritious, very sweet. That is the main and basically the only source of food the indigenous peoples of the Southwest historically were using as a food source. Just inside that layer, you have what this whole thing, which I would call the bean. And that consists of an outer sort of shell. It's kind of like trapezoidal in shape. And that's totally inedible. That outer shell is just fibrous, super hard. You can't eat it. There's no way to grind it up or reduce it further. Totally inedible. But it does have a seed inside that shell. So the seed is technically edible. But in my research showing like 30 something tribes of the Southwest ate the mesquite pods, the mesocarp. Only 4 of those ate the seeds. And all of those, of those 4, at least 3 had to cook the seeds. The seeds contain a trypsin inhibitor. It's an anti-nutrient, so it's hard to digest. So it was ground up and cooked generally. But it's a huge pain to get to that seed, even though it was a big part of the pods. You can gather so many pods, and the mesocarp is so easy to extract and so delicious that it was basically just always discarded. The bean was. So eat the mesocarp, spongy layer, and you can find that if you break open a mesquite pod, you'll basically always break in between a bean, and you'll be able to see that mesocarp directly, and you can chew it up and spit out the fibers, and you can taste that mesocarp, which is, I would describe it as a very sweet, almost caramel-like layers flavor, a little bit of tamarind flavor into it, maybe a little bit of tartness to it. And depending on the tree, it can be a little bit bitter, but usually only slightly. You can eat the beans at any stage. They were eaten by natives throughout the Southwest, everywhere mesquite occurs, and they were eaten at all stages, essentially. Even the flowers were eaten, especially brewed into a tea. It makes a delicious tea. Those are the flowers in the top left with those big spikes. But when they're green, they're rather bitter. Or the more green they are, the more bitter they tend to be. And then they do differ by individual. So some trees produce really delicious bean pods with a lot of mesocarp and aren't very bitter, and other ones are kind of narrow bean pods and tend to be a little bit bitter. So it's good to shop around, but you can find some that are basically aren't bitter at all and they're very delicious. Yeah.
Odds.
When they start falling and they're ready to go. Yeah, basically. So midsummer is when they start to peak. And that's when how I judge whether they're ready. So first, if they're falling from the tree, the good signs, you pick one up or you pull one from a tree and you shake it and you hear a little rattling. That's that seed inside. It's rattling. It means it's fully mature. And yeah, so when it's falling from the tree, or it's very easy to pluck off the tree, and it typically develops this fully tan color. A lot of times that's like some reddish streaks in it. So definitely no green in it at all, and it should be rather hard and inflexible. A lot of people tell you don't gather mesquite pods from the ground. And this all originates from a single study in Arizona where the mesquite pods were gathered months after they fell, and they had high concentrations of aflatoxin from aspergillus. So it's kind of a flawed study. I gathered most of my mesquite pods from the ground, and that's probably the main way they're gathered historically. Yeah.
Would you say that the mesquite was #1 versus #2 pecan because it was more widely distributed and it just had more different uses than the pecan?
Yeah, so it has a lot of carbohydrates. Pecan doesn't have as much carbohydrates, and funnily enough, carbohydrates were kind of the limiting food source back in the day, or in pre-contact times, or for hunter-gatherers. Finding a lot of carbohydrates was a huge priority. So you can find fat and animal sources much more easily, but carbohydrates, what's the carbohydrate source in an animal that doesn't really have it? So mesquite being 87% carbohydrates in the mesocarp and very easy to process, and then also being just produced so incredibly abundantly is why I would place them at #1 versus #2. But it's a little bit arbitrary. I mean, you do get calories and nutrition from both, and pecan is also produced prolifically. But I would say that just from the perspective of a hunter-gatherer at the time, that carbs would have been seen a little bit more valuable. So yeah, I gather most of them from the ground. Often I'll shake the tree to gather them and store them in huge abundance. So how are they processed and eaten though? Because if you've ever seen a mesquite pod, like where you can chew on it, and like I said, you don't eat the bean. How are they extracting just this mesocarp? Well, 2 main ways. One is the easy way, and it's very universal, mesquite drink. So the historical method of this is take a giant mortar and pestle, because like you can see that mesquite pods are huge. You need a huge mortar and pestle to grind them up, and this one's made out of a willow trunk. It's actually a little bit on the small side for what was being used historically. Cyrus when he wrote about this, he said that the natives in Texas were just digging a big hole in the ground and pounding the dirt to pack it, and then using a giant tree branch wielded by two people to crush up a whole bunch. So this is a little small side example, but it works. The whole pods were ground into a meal, reduced as much as possible. And this is why it's important to get them when they're very mature. Because when they're not as mature and just not fully dried out, they'll just form a sticky mass, and you won't be able to reduce them much further than some large chunks. So often they were sun dried after being gathered, or even toasted with some sand or something. But you can reduce them into a meal, and then you add water and strain it. It's as easy as that. You have a mesquite drink. Like I said, it tastes like caramel and tamarind. It's incredibly delicious, super easy. And this was in like every household of the Southwest in the early days. And so obviously, that's not going to last super long. It's got water in there, so it's going to spoil at some point. Although a lot of times it was allowed to slightly ferment and probably to improve the digestibility, not to the point of any sort of producing alcohol or anything intoxicating, but just probably improving that digestibility and preserving it for a little bit longer. But if you want to make mesquite meal, the process is somewhat similar. A little extra steps, though, a little bit harder, but it lasts a lot longer. So you start out with the same step. Although for this one, you really make sure it's completely dry so you can grind up the pods to a fine powder. And then once you've gotten it powdered, you'll still have a bunch of fibers from the skin and a bunch of beans in there, and you just sift those out. So it was historically done with specialized sifting baskets, but nowadays you can do that with just like a wire mesh strainer. I use like a flour sifter especially for that to make some really nice fine mesquite meal flour. And my hack for mesquite drink is to take the whole pods, throw them in a blender, add water, blend it up, and then strain that with the wire mesh strainer. It's very, very easy to do. So if you want to try mesquite pods, I recommend that. Okay, and then acorns. So right here I have pictured the escarpment live oak, Quercus fusiform, is probably the worst species for acorn in the area, but it's usable for food, just like every species of acorn. These ones are the worst for the area and probably weren't even used at all by indigenous peoples, except for maybe in emergency, some sort of famine food. They are super abundant, but they're small. They're kind of on the bitter side as far as tannins, not like super tannic, but definitely it's in the middle. The main reason that they're not good for processing food is their high rates of insect damage and infestation. And this is just based on my personal experience trying to process these many years in a row. They're often have very, very high rates of damage, unlike many of the other acorn species in the area. But they do produce a decent acorn meal. I've done it, and you can find some individuals producing some rather large acorns. Uh, and this is just showing a good spot to gather them because you can't really gather them in an intact forest, so you can never find them in the leaf litter, but like a creek bed like that is very easy to gather. But it is super abundant tree. So here's the better ones if you want to gather acorn. Now, neither of these are actually native to Travis County, but they are both native to Central Texas. Obviously, not Travis County now. I don't know if they're native here, but the top one, we have the bur oak. It's got the Justin Bieber 2000s haircut, so it's very easy to ID. It has unique. It has that cup that stays on the acorn. So if you find an acorn on the ground with the cup still on, it means it was bad, it was aborted by the tree. Not so with the bur oak. It has that hat still on, which kind of gives it an extra step of processing. You always have to crack that hat off first, and then crack the hole. The bur oak is nice for acorn meal because it has so much kernel meat in there. So, but a problem that starts is that it's more likely to go bad and get mold on it before you can completely dry out because it's so thick. It's harder to dry out completely. So with the bur oak, I always crack it first as soon as I gather it and then immediately dry the kernels. With the other acorns, you can dry them like this with the holes still on. And then at the bottom, we have the chinkapin oak. That's my favorite oak for acorn meal in the area. It's very sweet, has very few tannins in it, and very commonly planted conveniently. So I gather it in the city park, which just has mown grass underneath. It's very easy to pick up. But mainly the acorns are large and sweet. Now, the process of making an acorn meal, as many different ways, but the basic, most generic one is to crack open the hull. And then inside that, you have like a kernel skin enveloping the kernel. Usually you can rub that off, or it even just will fall off on its own. And then you have the kernel. The kernel is the part that you eat. It's entirely edible, except in all acorns, it's bitter at first when it's raw, because it has tannins in it. So you have to leach out those tannins. And all you really need to leach it out is water. Soak the acorns in water and let it strain out. But if you're using cold water, you kind of have to grind up the acorns really fine. So the highest quality acorn meal is going to be found by grinding up that kernel, extremely fine powder, and then leaching it with cold water. And you can do that in a basin of sand or in a basket, or people nowadays will use like a cloth or even just put it into a bowl and pour it off periodically. But a few soakings of the cold water with the acorn meal, if it's ground very, very fine, should be all that you really need. Now, if you don't grind it very fine, you might need to use warm water, and there's a lot of different practices used. Sometimes you start out with cold water and increase the temperature as needed and intermittently tasting it, however many soakings you need until those tannins are gone. Other methods, I mentioned this earlier with the ashes, like this is the Ojibwe process. The bur oak acorn kernels are so large, they just boil them in a big pot of water with wood ash, basically lye, to help leach out those tannins. And then obviously you need to rinse them after that. Another really lazy method maybe is to bury a bunch of acorns in a clay bank of a creek and then just allow nature to do its thing. The clay is probably binding those tannins, and the gradual soaking of the rivers also cleaning them out, and you dig them up and eat them. I don't know if it's going to taste as good that way though. But acorns, probably not a huge food source in Central Texas, but most likely utilize at least some extent. And definitely in years where maybe you don't have a good mesquite crop, acorns would be very important because they're very rich in carbohydrates, but they also have a good composition of fats and protein. And here's some listed native oak species. Yeah, I think the Texas red oak is probably one of the top choices for natives of at least Travis County, where those other ones don't occur, and maybe in other areas because it's very abundant and it has large kernels. They're not super tannic, mainly the fact that they're large and abundant. Like I said, the Texas live oak is kind of useless. Bur oak is good. Blackjack oak, that was actually one that was eaten raw. I've tried them raw. I'm not sure if they're adequate that way, but they are one of the least tannic ones. But then again, my favorite is the Chinkapone oak. I think those are the sweetest. We have some more. The bastard oak. I haven't tried those ones. The post oak, that's very similar to the live oak, so not too great. And then the actual live oak is also not super good. That's just ones I have listed. Oh, here's me grinding up the acorn meal with a limestone mortar. So these bedrock mortar, I mean, this isn't bedrock, but mortars like this made in the limestone bedrock are a common feature we see throughout Central Texas. Many archaeological sites include these, and most likely they were being used to process mesquite meal, a lot of different stuff, but acorns probably weren't a big thing that they're used. I don't know if there's been analysis of the residue of that. There probably isn't much left on this. But yeah, a lot of people think that it's a problem. This is how to make it. See, it's a harder stone, like a chert cobble, to pound into a pecket. And this only took me 4 hours to make it. So it's not much work, but there's a lot of strain on the hands. But you'll get a little bit of limestone dust in there. It's good for you. It's not going to chew up your teeth. Your teeth are way harder than limestone. You don't need to worry about that. But this is kind of what you need if you want to get it really, really fine. And actually, this isn't even enough. The way to get a really fine meal is to take that meal and put it into a basket and then pour out the meal from a basket. And what is left sticking in the weave of the basket is the only meal that you keep. And you get that by turning that upside down and hitting it with a stick really sharply. And so you only get the meal that's fine enough to stick into the weave of the basket. But that's if you want to only use cold water to retain the highest grade of acorn meal, because if you use warm water, it's going to leach out the fats and it won't be as good. So here we have a dewberry. This is ripening right now. This is one of the most delicious. Kavesi Devaka, he wrote it in April. the Karankawa spent the entire month basically just celebrating eating like a whole bunch of the dewberry and of course a bunch of yopon tea as well. So this is Rubus trivialis. This is basically the only Rubus species we have, wild native Rubus species in the area. But the Rubus genus is incredibly important for natives throughout all of North America. There's a lot of species, like 30 something, and just in the US. And all of them were eaten. You know, we have your blackberry and raspberry, salmonberry, thimbleberry. There's a lot. They're all eaten and they're all very delicious. Yeah.
Does that variety grow on stalks or does it grow on like a vine on the ground?
It's kind of like Scandent. It's basically on the ground, forming nice patches. It kind of likes open areas. It's always very low. Sometimes you find it like climbing a little bit over some low branches, but it's basically like a ground cover. But yeah, it's definitely got a patchy distribution. You find it nice. Like this one's totally in the open sunlight there. Um, my last dewberry patch got turned into condos, unfortunately, so I'll have to find a new one. But they're so incredibly delicious, better than any blackberry you can buy at a grocery store. There's nothing can compare to this. You can also eat the flowers, make a nice little garnish, and also the growing young tips, a little bit astringent, but make a nice little tea. Yeah. There's tons. They're all over really, but I had a particular spot that was like really dense and was growing them really, really good. Uh, yeah, the ones I'm talking about are in Austin, but it does grow around here. And yeah, yeah. Look at the range map. We've got tons of it right over here. It's basically the main one in this area. Yeah, yeah, I find it sometimes it likes to grow near like rivers and creeks beds, but doesn't really care that much about the soil being wet. It just more likes the an open sort of low area to grow on. You can definitely find it if you look for it. Oh, and here's kind of just listing all the different species that were eaten and all the different tribes that ate them. As you can see, there's a ton that I found in my research. Oh, a little interesting fun factoid: the way the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, used way they dried these fruits because they're so delicate. I find that they're really delicious, but you have to like be very gentle when you pick them off the plant. So the way that the Iroquois uh, dried them was to break the stem, holding the fruits, and allow them to dry on the stem. So smart. Maybe wicking, even helping dry them by wicking it out. And also, they don't have to handle it directly before it dried. So yeah, drying fruits would be the number one way. It was preserved, basically the only way wild fruits, fleshy fruits especially, were preserved by indigenous peoples throughout North America. That's the way I still harvest and dry and preserve almost all my fruits. A lot of people want to think you got to can them or juice them or do all this stuff. I'm way too lazy for that. I just dry them all. And that comes into handy. I'll discuss that in grapes later because you know, have you ever had a Mustang grape and it kind of causes that burning sensation? I don't know if you try that, but they can cause a burning sensation if you eat them raw. Drying them totally gets rid of that. So here we have a really fun category of fruits. There's one, this lower one ripening right now. I don't think it's a very good year for them, but we kind of have, this is a very unique area. We have like four species of mulberry, four species of sumac, three species of walnut. Like no area of North America can say that basically, except for maybe a couple counties in Oklahoma. Central Texas is very unique. We're the area where Rus aromatica and Rus trilobata meets. So Rus aromatic, where's the range? Is that supposed to be? Oh, this is the combined range map. This the GBIF. This is the database I use for a lot of my research. There's so many erroneous identifications of these. It was already kind of confused. If you combine them, it makes much more sense. So anyway, officially though, in better databases for this sort of thing, the eastern half of the country is Rus aromatica, just a little bit more matte leaves, a little bit more um, larger leaves. And then the western half of the country of Rus trilobata, the skunk bush sumac, but otherwise is essentially identical. And those produce these smaller clusters, smaller fruits, but you can gather a ton of these. And gather them in the way I said, where you whack the branches into a receptacle basket. I have a little foraging method I use that's special. But That one produces a lot. And then at the top, you have your evergreen sumac, Rus virens. This one's kind of weird. It fruits in like January. So these are fruiting like now, or maybe, what is it, late May? Maybe it's going to be a little bit before we get those. But the other one here, this is the best one. This is one that I gather the most of the fruits from, which is Rus lanceolata, or the flame leaf sumac. And I think it's the best because it has these big clusters. You see each one of those is just a cluster, so you can snap off a cluster and get a ton. And this is the top left, why it's called flame leaf. But so the reason these were, well, sumacs in general were consumed by indigenous North Americans very commonly, and one of the main ways they were used to make sumac aid, which is a tart, sweet drink, nice and refreshing. So this, see how these are kind of fuzzy? The outer covering of sumac fruits are covered with malic acid, which is like an ingredient that's often used to make candy tart. It's got a very tart taste to it, and so you can mash them up, add some water, strain it out, and you have sumac aid. Or you can just dry the whole fruits, powder them for storage, and use them for the same way, or use them as a spice in Middle Eastern cuisine. So basically, all sumacs are usable in the same way. Uh, Here we have the detail. Yeah,
To that spice store. Do you know, what part are they drying for that?
the fruits of Rus cororia. Yeah, that's the Middle Eastern spice, very commonly Middle Eastern cuisine, but it tastes essentially identical to what you can make from all of these native sumac species. I haven't tried it with the Rus virens because they don't produce that many, but with the other ones, especially Rus lanceolata, I made the exact same thing, where you just get the entire fruit, dry it, and grind it into a powder, usable as a spice or just to make that drink. Uh, yeah, yeah, those are just the details. Little sumacs everywhere. What else do I have to say about it? Yeah, their malic acid content very high. They have a lot of people think they have high in citric acid. That's actually rather low for citric acid, or vitamin C is what I'm thinking. Actually, people think that they're high in vitamin C. They're not really, but they are very high in carotenoids. Okay, this is an excellent one right here. I was actually just eating some of these before the meeting because they're starting to ripen right now. Not quite there yet, but they'll get there. This is probably one of the best things to forage in Central Texas. Really delicious, and you can gather a ton of them. Agarita, Berber's trifoliolata. Uh, so these are definitely, you got to gather them with some sort of net. I have my foraging net is just like a hoop to which, oh, I actually have a picture of it. Yeah, it's like it's hoop. And I've sewn some canvas cloth to it, and I have this handle that goes across it, and then I have my stick, a second version of it. You just shove that into the plant underneath the fruiting branches, then you whack the fruiting branches with the stick, and all the ripe fruits fall into it. It's a very easy way to collect. I can gather like I forget the rate, I think like 15 pounds of fruits in a half hour or something. So really, really high rates of gathering a lot of the delicious fruits, and uh, they're very sweet, a little bit sour, and I dry almost all of these for storage and just eat them plain or in smoothies. And you can rehydrate them and use them for canning or juice or whatever. I don't really bother with all that. I just dry them and eat them.
Cyrus, you mentioned again that you tried to use the same type of tools for gathering that Native Americans were.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's basically an adaptation of it. The only difference would be I haven't found any references that fabric was ever used. Fabric is rather uncommon in pre-contact times or early contact indigenous cultures. So this would pretty much be basketry would be the ones they're using. Sometimes they have handles, other times they wouldn't, and they would often be specialized for whatever the exact target would be. And even the stick was not necessarily a stick. Sometimes, a lot of times, it was like a basketry racket, something that was made especially to whack the plants with. And sometimes a big burden basket, deep one was used. But I like the fabric. It's just very easy to do. Basketry takes a long time, and the fabric is also nice because it kind of dampens the, the fruits from bouncing out. Because I've tried to use like flatter baskets before, and the fruits will just like bounce off. It's very annoying with the fabric. doesn't do that. But yeah, I basically derived that from what I learned about indigenous cultures. And it's still, I don't know what you could possibly use with more modern materials that would really be better than that. Huh?
A sheet.
People always say this about Agarita. It sounds so good theoretically. I've read this in a bunch of books too, and I used to subscribe to this. But then you go out in the field and you're looking at the Agarita bush, and you're like, "How am I going to put a sheet under that?" Because the spiny branches go all the way to the ground. It's often covered. Like there's other trees on the side. It's like an almost dense scrub. It sounds very good, but I think it's only useful in certain applications, like maybe if it's a landscaping plant, you've neatly pruned it, because otherwise, I shove it under there and like just get poked a bunch of the way. I'm just gonna shove my thing in there and whack it and then move all around the plant. It's very efficient. Also, this beautiful yellow wood was a very popular dye for natives of Texas, like the Apache use it for the dye of their buckskin. Okay, so we have our Prunus genus. What do I have in here? Okay, yeah, I have the
Question on Zoom,
yeah.
are berries of poison sumac actually poison?
I knew I should have covered this. Okay, let's go back. Uh, so poison sumac, you don't have to worry about it. They're not red. You see how these fruits are very bright red? All true sumacs in the genus Rus are red. Also fuzzy, and they're also born erect on the plant. The fruits of Toxicodendron species, such as Toxicodendron vernix or poison sumac, are white to cream color, or maybe green if they're unripe, and they are smooth and they hang down. So even just that one character, red versus not red, it should be enough to distinguish poison sumac from a true sumac or Rus species. But
Sumac is poison.
yes, I'm totally speculating here, but I think that the fruits of Toxicodendron species have very little urushiol in them, very little of that poisonous compound in them. Obviously, don't eat them. They should be considered poisonous for all intents and purposes. But yeah, that's my best answer. And then now a little aside to that, if you are allergic to mango or cashews, maybe avoid eating sumac, because all of those plants are the Anacardiaceae, the sumac family, and they all have urushiol. That's what makes people allergic to mango or cashew is a slight presence of urushiol, which is a compound in poison ivy that gives you the rash. Yeah.
Is poison sumac and the other sumacs related at all?
Yeah, they're both in the Anacardiaceae, the sumac family. So they look a little bit like they both have pinnately compound foliage, but the fruits are a dead giveaway. Also, poison sumac is only a few counties in East Texas. So in this area, it's not even here at all. Yeah, that's one that trips people up because it's called a sumac, but it's really Toxicodendron. Yeah. Okay, the prunus species. So I'll start out just with the list here. The Chickasaw plum, Mexican plum, and black cherry are the main ones in the area that would be good food sources. We do have several others, but let's not worry about them. We actually even have a Prunus minutaflora. That one's a really interesting one, the Texas almond. But you see they all have this inner seed, this kernel that looks just like an almond. It's hard to tell a little bit from that one, but up close it looks just like a little almond. And actually, the cohuia would render those edible from Prunus ilicifolia in Southern California. They were most likely leaching out the cyanide. Otherwise, you don't want to eat the pits of the cherries or the plums raw, or really just at all, because they contain plenty of cyanide. And really, all the plant parts do. But the twigs were brewed into tea by various natives, especially Prunus serratina, this one, black cherry. Now, black cherry, is in the Prunus genus. And now the Prunus genus, just in general, I don't know if I have a range map of the whole genus, probably not. But found out throughout North America, tons of species, a lot of them very important food sources for natives throughout all of North America. And then you have two main groupings of the food source ones. You have the cherries, which have a black flesh, tend to be smaller, tend to be a little bit more bitter taste. A lot of them called choke cherry. I think this one might have that as a common name. Yeah, choke cherry or black cherry, because that has a lot of bitter taste. And then you have the prunus or the wild plum species, which are bigger and have like a yellowish flesh. Those are the best ones, in my opinion. You can get the most from them. They're all just insanely delicious, better than any plum or most fruits that you can get at a grocery store, which are picked unripe. Plum, about this big, maybe it's similar to the size of like a cherry that you can buy at the grocery store. And the wild cherries are smaller than that, about half the size, maybe about that big. The wild plums can get pretty big, nice size. And so I gather a ton of these. My favorite ones to gather is the Chickasaw plum. This one's a little bit more eastern, but it's just easier to gather because it's more clonal shrub, and so it's just you can just reach them more easily. But it tastes basically identical to the Mexican plum, which is a single trunked tree most of the time. But that one's more common on Edwards Plateau and just western central Texas. But both incredibly delicious and most likely very important food sources. The Prunus mexicana was most likely being cultivated or semi-cultivated by some natives in the southeast. It says no records there for food, but that's not quite, that's a little bit misleading. I just don't have any exact tribe name for that. It's often found at old sites, old archaeological sites where Indians were inhabiting. You find this species there unusually more abundant. And the Prunus serratina, that one's okay. Like I said, it's a little bit bitter. You can gather plenty of it, and it's got a nice color to it, but a little bit bitter. But yeah, this is the Mexican plum, easy to pick out in the spring when it's just covered with the flowers. And then the Prunus angustifolia, narrow leaf angustifolia distinguishes it very easily from the very wide Mexican plum. But yeah, like I said, the clonal shrub versus a tree also distinguishes it. Okay, then we have our Mustang grape. This one you can probably gather more fleshy fruits from than anything else in the area. I gathered like five-gallon buckets full of this every summer, ripens in midsummer. And the big challenge is finding one you can reach. So this would have been extremely important for natives in the area and was eaten by a lot of them to have that in there who ate this. Oh, I only have one reference there. Like I said, the references for Texas are very sparse, but Vitis species in general were extremely important food sources for indigenous peoples throughout North America, basically all of them. Did you know that Vitis evolved as a genus in North America? And Central Texas is actually kind of the epicenter of evolution. There's a ton of species here. There's actually the hybrid of, I think it's Vitis berlandieri and then another Central Texas species. They hybridize and then that hybrid is used as a rootstock for every grape grown worldwide, including all these like fancy uh, wine grapes in France and all that stuff. All those are grown in a Central Texas hybrid rootstock cultivar. So every bottle of French wine is a little bit of Texas in there. Be sure to tell everyone Frenchman that. And then you have these four species that aren't Mustang grape in the area. They're very easy to distinguish just by the underside of the leaf being white in the Mustang grape. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. Yeah.
I have a bunch of grapevines on my property, but all I can see and get to are just the bare stalk. Because all the leaves and the fruit are 30 feet up in the air or higher.
Yeah, that's the big challenge with foraging the grapes. So I always recommend people look for an area like a riverside or a creekside where the vines are cascading down from the canopy into an area where you can reach. But really, the places where I gather most grapes from are from an 8 foot tall chain link fence at a public park that's just completely loaded with grapevines. It's like my personal vineyard. So yeah, finding them growing low to the ground is a challenge. But if you can find a good spot, you can definitely gather as much as you can possibly want from them. Fences are definitely a good spot. But yeah, also the forest edges, you can find them. Yeah, it's frustrating. I'll be walking along a trail and I'll see so many grapes and all the squirrels having a blast up there eating them, but can't reach. But yeah. Um, so like a grocery store grape, if you made it a lot less sweet and more tart, and then put some big seeds in there. Sounds great, right? We've all been so tricked by modern food production to thinking that this sweet little grocery store grape is where it's at. But I love the taste of the Mustang grapes. Yeah, they're less sweet and a little bit more tart, but I still like them a lot. You gotta shift your perspective and just appreciate the nasty flavor. No, they're not nasty at all. They're just definitely tart and not nearly as sweet as anything you can get. And I do so I mentioned this earlier. If you eat them raw, they can sometimes cause a burning sensation in your mouth, and even on your hands if you try to process them a bunch into juice. But cooking it or drying it totally gets rid of that compound. I'm not sure exactly is doing that, but all you need to do to reduce that is to cook it or dry it. So I'll take the whole grape cluster, which by the way is the way you want to harvest them. You never want to try to pull off one grape at a time. The skin will come off. That's actually the way squirrels eat them. They always remove the skin before eating them. But gather the whole cluster, and if you really want to be quick and lazy about it, like I am, you make some juice, throw that whole cluster, stems and all, into a blender, add some water, and then strain it. And then take that juice and then cook that, get that up to boiling temperature to make sure it gets rid of that burning component. And you can just can it, or you can add some sugar and water and get it to taste pretty much just like a grape juice that you buy at a store, or make some jelly out of it. But I dry most of the bottom like these, using an oven or dehydrator, or sun drying them. But the dehydrator works best of all. And then those obviously don't look like a raisin you'll buy at the grocery store. I don't know what they do at grocery stores to make raisins that way, but these aren't nearly as sweet. They're rather tart and crispy. But when you dry them, the seeds are also dry, and so they're very easy to crunch up whole, and adding a lot of nutrition to that, actually, a lot of extra proteins and fats. And these are just the other species in the area. The Vitis berlandieri, the Spanish grape at the top, Vitis monticola on the left is very glossy. So these have that long leaf apex. Spanish grape, these are very glossy and thick. Estivalis is that very wide, lobing interior. And then Vitis cinerea is kind of just what's left over. Gray bark grape. Do I have another one? Yeah, those are the main ones. And yeah, these are all the native tribes that ate the grapes in my research and all the species that were consumed. Here's me drying grapes out on the table. By the way, you sun drying fruits, you don't want to have them exposed directly to sunlight. You want to cover them. This is just the first step. You got to take them off the stem. Also, each individual, if you want to dry them to make the best product, I'm gonna have some grape juice in the left. Okay, a prickly pear. This would probably be, I'd put it like number 3 as far as wild plant food sources for hunter-gatherers of Central Texas and really throughout the Southwest. It was an incredibly important food source. Here we mainly just have Apuntia engelmannii, although there's a few others. But I think it lists them here. Yeah, the Indian fig is a weird one. I'm not sure. Oops. This is a common cultivar. It's one that doesn't have the big spines, that was domesticated in Mesoamerica thousands of years ago, domesticated as a food source, also as a host plant for the cochineal plant, that little dye bug. You can pull off a cactus and get that carmine dye. But you also have Pucha humilis and probably some other prickly pear species. I don't know. It's not important to list them all. They're all usable the same way and used by Southwest natives extremely commonly. So number one, be the fruit. Now, a lot of people think you got to burn off the fruits, the spines, or peel them, but you don't need to do any of that. You just rub them off. Glow kids can just be rubbed off very easily, and that's the main way that they're processed by indigenous peoples of the Southwest historically. You just they probably the way I do it is I grab them with some tongs, twist them off the plant, and then take a brush and brush off the glow kids and put them in my bag. So you don't brush them off before putting in the bag. This is stick into one another. But you can also use, you can just like put them on the ground and then rub them on like some sandy soil with some brush. You can use buckskin to rub off the glow kids. And I always recommend people like rinse them off after rubbing off the spines because a little bit can adhere to them. But it's very, very easy to just simply rub off the spines. I use a brush made out of grass, which is very historical, or like a skin brush works really well. So roll off the glow kids, and then the way I process most of them is also the same way it was done by indigenous peoples. Most commonly, cut them in half like that, and then dry them. And you see the packed full of these seeds. If you try to eat a bunch of whole prickly pear fruits, you're going to get some intestinal obstruction. I do not recommend eating a whole bunch raw and whole because those seeds are hard. You won't be able to digest them. They're going to pack your guts and stop you up. But they are edible, actually. So the way I process them, cut them in half, dry them. And then at that point, it's pretty easy to scrape those seeds out. So scrape them out. And then what's left is basically fruit leather, which is very delicious, very sweet. It's like a watermelon taste actually to it. I don't know if y'all have had prickly pear, but it's got a little bit of that taste. And then the seeds, scrape them out and then pound them into a meal and cook that into a mush. That was the way it was historically processed. And that's the way I do it. So really easy to get a ton of nutrition that way. And also, by the way, I'll cover this in a second, but these ripen, if you time it right, you can get these and Texas persimmon at the same time in the same habitat. Texas persimmon is my absolute favorite. By the way, you can eat those flower buds. These are all over the cacti right now. You can eat those. Those were eaten by the cahuilla for cooking them in the earth oven. Similarly, you have to rub off those glow kids, but you can cook them and eat them. They taste really, really good. And actually, the seeds of those haven't developed yet, so you can eat them whole. And also in the top right, if you have the pads, and the pads are young and flexible still, and still have these vestigial leaves, those little fleshy cones. That's the time in which you want to gather them, slice them apart, cook them, use them for nopales, nopalitos, very common in Mexican cuisine still, really good. And those are a very important food source in this time of the year, more like early spring. You don't have a lot of other wild plant resources, not a lot of fruits being produced, but those are good wild plant foods at that time of year. Stuff to say about that. Yeah, prickly pears are found. Young prickly pear go all the way down to like, was it almost the tip of Argentina, like very far down in South America, and then all the way up to north of Edmonton, Canada. So they're found absolutely everywhere in the Americas. Eaten by a lot of different natives. Cabeza de Vaca referred to the Karankawa as those of the figs. Yeah, it was basically enslaved to gather prickly pears. Oh, and right after, yeah, when this is what I was just referring to. This is my favorite fruit in the whole world. I think the most delicious fruit ever made. By God, thank you, God, or whatever nature. This is Texas persimmon, Diospyros texana. Seriously, incredibly delicious. If y'all never had this, I highly recommend it. There's really just nothing that's quite like it. Maybe if you've had a regular persimmon, those aren't nearly as good. They are sweet, just like a regular persimmon, but they also have a more rich flavor and like a nice texture to them, almost like pudding. And their flesh is like a pure black. I should have put a sliced one in here. They have pure black flesh and incredibly good. So you can find a ton of these if you go to the right area. Although only 1 in 9 is fruiting and is female. I'm not really sure. There's a great explanation for that, probably something with population energetics, but there's enough of them to gather as much as you can possibly want. At least I know the areas where I can gather as much as I want. And wildlife love these too. So if you're wondering if these are in season, just look for some coyote scat that's been dyed black. They'll tell you.
Here.
Yeah.
They're here, they're everywhere.
Yeah, they're a little like drier, sort of open upland habitats. You do find them sometimes in like enclosed canopies, and often they will grow tall. But I like them when they stay kind of a small shrub in more of an open savanna type habitat. That's where this photo was taken. Also, that's when you find them alongside the prickly pears, and you can hit them both up at the same time. And yeah, they have this peeling bark. It's very beautiful form. Duffins curls of the peeling bark, but this smooth grayish bark, you probably can't see it very well, but that's a great way to pick them out in the field. That's what I do to just find them, just scan the forest and look for that bright gray, smooth peeling bark.
Never get to put the ear in the other birds and things like that, get it before we can get to them.
Yeah, the other animals do love it. And an interesting thing about the persimmons is they stay good for very long. And there's actually research on this showing that the ripe fruits have some particular antimicrobial compound in them that prevents them from decay. So often I'll see coyote scat dyed black from these like in November and stuff, like way long after they've dropped. And I'll find them still sometimes hanging on the tree like after they've been there ripe for more than a month, and I'll eat them and they'll still be pretty much perfectly good. Sometimes like a little bit of fermented flavor to it, but I don't mind. They're still delicious.
What can we do with them? Have you done anything with them besides just eat them? I ate them, I wasn't real fun, but we ferment things and we do apple hard up cider, and I've made prickly pear hard up cider. I read a hard up cider, and I have made persimmon hard up cider, although I haven't drank it yet. It's not ready. But I have like 10 cups of this stuff that I process by cooking it enough to mash it and sieve it and get rid of all the seed. But I don't know what to do with it now because I have so much left over.
Yeah, so that's essentially what I do with it to make the pulp. Well, first off, so I didn't mention, but persimmons, just in general, if they're not completely ripe, they can often be very astringent and unpleasant to eat. So if they have any bit of green on them at all, just don't even bother. If they're hard at all, don't bother. They should be very soft and fully ripe. But if I manage to, well, I always manage this, but I eat a lot whole. But if I the ones that I have left over and I want to process further, I will cook down in a big pot on a low simmer till they basically disintegrate. Sometimes I'll use like a potato masher to help along the disintegration. And then I will sift out the skins and the seeds. And I'll just use a wire mesh strainer for that. Often I'll need to like add some extra water in order to make the extraction fully efficient. So I'll end up with kind of some watery pulp, and then I'll cook that down into the oven to like a very thick pulp consistency. And that I can can it hot. Or actually, I find a lot of times you don't. I've kept a lot that I didn't do the sterile canning method with, and it never went bad. It's kind of weird, but what I'll do with that pulp is basically one thing because I really like this one thing a lot, and it's to take the pulp and mix it 50-50 with coconut cream, and then put that in a blender and blend it smooth, and then just eat that as is, like a pudding, or if we really be fancy, throw it into an ice cream maker and make Texas persimmon coconut cream ice cream. I had that last night. It was incredibly delicious. Yeah, it's so sweet that you don't need any sweetener. So find just the coconut cream, or you can use like regular milk cream as well. I just think the coconut cream is a little bit better, but that's my favorite thing. Yeah.
I heard that they have a strong, you have to be careful how many you eat because they have a strong laxative effect.
This is something I hear with pretty much every wild plant food. I don't think that it's really the plant. I don't think it's the Texas persimmon or anything else I've heard about that. I think it's when people haven't really eaten much of that and they try it for the first time, and maybe there's some microbes on there the body's not as familiar with, and it's causing that effect. I think that that effect can be had with pretty much any wild plant food if it's your first time eating any significant amount of it. So yeah, I don't think it's in some innate property of the plant, but that brings up a really interesting point about prickly pear. Prickly pear is a especially strong example of this, where and this was even remarked on by many of the early Spanish explorers, that the first time they ate prickly pear, they got sick, like really sick, like a fever, diarrhea, vomiting, malaise, just like some weird sensation, something you would associate with like a bad fever, essentially. But well, we don't know exactly what it was. It wasn't like an intestinal obstruction from the seeds, although I know people that's happened to. This is a very particular effect that seems to be, and they were eating it how it was processed by the natives, so they probably weren't even eating the seeds in some of these cases. But I've never really been able to figure out why that effect happens, but it's definitely the first time a significant amount is eaten, and then thenceforth it never happens again. And I've heard the anecdotes from people nowadays, plenty of people foraging prickly pear for the first time, eating it for the first time, and then having similar effects, especially the fever and the headache. So be aware if you've never had prickly pear, that can't happen the first time. But all it takes is once, and then you're good. You got to get immune. Yeah, Comanche love these, Tonkawa, Karankawa, natives in Central Texas. This is one we have some good evidence of natives in Texas actually eating and being fond of because it's a prominent species. It's super delicious. Of course they eat it. The Comanche name for it is just black persimmon. Oops. Okay, juniper. Now this one's a very controversial one. A lot of people like to hate on juniper, like similar to the way they hate on mesquite, because it is kind of taken over. Historically, we would have had much more of the old growth junipers, the straight trunk big ones, and much more open prairie, with the old growth junipers supporting a prairie habitat beneath them, grass directly below growing. But the early settlers of Texas wanted to cut them all down and then extirpate the bison, put up fences, and stop all the burning. So now we have a lot of the woody encroachment of the junipers, and I think that's where a lot of the juniper hate comes from. People just hate how successful it is. Similar to mesquite, the ranchers went and go cut them all down, and they all popped back up because they're found in the seed bank, and they have the biggest, longest tap roots of any species in the world. So they're doing great, and people just hate to see people succeed, don't you? No. But the juniper fruits, I think, are really good. Now, if you ever tried juniper fruits and you think that they're awful, you're probably right. Maybe you just didn't have the right one, though. I always say that only about a fifth of juniper trees, the individuals, produce good fruits. About 80% of them are kind of small, bitter, very get that very strong gin flavor to them. I'm sure you're familiar with that flavor that they have, particularly the juniper berries. But you can find some, like this one here, a lot of flesh, very juicy, very sweet, and not so bitter. Definitely still always that unique flavor juniper berries have, but shop around, try some juniper fruits from different trees. And this is what natives did also in the Southwest, where junipers were very commonly consumed. They would shop around and find the trees which produce the best fruits, and then only bother with those. And that's what I do. So if you find some good ones, they have a fleshy cones, by the way, not actual fruits or berries, but you can remove the seed and then just get the pulp isolated if you want to use that for cooking. But also they make nice tea, and you can just eat them whole. The seeds are perfectly edible. You can crush them up into a paste or dry them and then grind them into a powder or a meal for cooking. And obviously you can get as much as you can possibly want of the juniper berries. And I got it in the same way I described for the agarita. But the needles of the junipers also make an excellent tea, or at least I like it. I drink juniper needle tea every single day. Also makes an amazing incense. Uh, Juniper needle incense was the most common incense, or one of the most common incenses used by natives throughout North America, many different species, the eastern red cedar in the eastern half of the country, and then a bunch of species in the southwest and throughout the rest of the country. But here we basically have juniper's ash juniper, this one depicted, and then your eastern red cedar right there. I think the eastern red cedar maybe a little bit better tasting, but the berries tend to be a bit smaller. The foliage definitely makes a little bit better flavor, but the foliage of the ash juniper makes a better incense. So I use this for incense.
The tea, what the needles, male or female or just
It doesn't really matter. The ghost ute preferred the ones with the male cones on them for medicinal tea. So it's a very common medicinal tea used for coughs, especially many different ailments, but most especially the coughs. And junipers had an insane amount of uses for natives of the Southwest and just throughout North America. I don't know if I want to get into all of them, but definitely those medicinal uses, like for a lot of ailments and like that. Incense wasn't just for deodorizing; it was often used as a part of a medicinal treatment or a sort of purification type of treatment for either a person or an area. So. But yeah, just in general, I think the ones with the cones would be considered more medicinal, the male cones. And then the material uses include the wood and the bark. The shredded bark is the best tinder you could possibly find for fire starting. And the wood is very rot resistant, which is why it was all cut down by the early settlers to use for houses and fence posts. Yeah, the junipers all over. All the native junipers essentially were used as food sources by a lot of natives, but especially in the Southwest. But definitely the eastern red cedar was also eaten. Don't have any evidence for the ash juniper being eaten, but as you can see, its range is very narrow, and that's kind of the area where you don't really have any good references for how Indians were living. Then we have our nettle. Uh, Basically just have a Urtica chamaedroides here, heartleaf nettle. The Urtica gracilis does occur here, but it's probably from transplanted individuals. It's barely ranging, but it doesn't really matter. They're all kind of usable in the same way. Okay. One more here. The nettle, just real quick, boil it, and then that kills off those stinging hairs. You can eat it. It's extremely nutritious, more nutritious than spinach or anything else like that. And then cattail, edible in all parts, especially the rhizomes, very carbohydrate rich. And then, as I mentioned, you can gather the pollen. The pollen tastes like wheat, very nutritious, one of the highest returns of calories obtained per calories expended used by the Southern Paiute. You can also eat those the forbidden corn dogs, those little fluff. You can burn off, pile up the fluff in a pile and then burn it, and that'll roast the seeds. You can sweep them up and grind them into a meal. But most of all, the rhizomes. And then the yucca, the stalk like this, the flowering stalk. When it's young, it's just like a giant asparagus. You can cook that and eat that. You can also eat the flowers. Some species of yucca, even the heart was eaten, but not this one. It's Yucca rupicola, which was leaf yucca, and then Spanish dagger, basically all used in the same way. And then yopon, the only caffeinated plant in all of North America, black drink, is consumed by all natives throughout this area, and even given areas where it doesn't occur, as 40% of the caffeine is coffee beans, and 10% of the theobromine is cocoa. Just make sure you use a ton if you want to do this. Boil it. You don't make just like a regular infusion out of it. You take the leaves, dry them, crush them up, put a double handful in a small pot of water, and boil it. When you strain it out, it should be black. That black color when you're looking through a glass, a little bit of yellowish foam on top. That's when you know you've made it right. And it does not cause vomiting. That it's just was associated with purgative rituals of natives in North America, and it got that association. That's not emetic. This is the way the Karankawa ate it, was to put it in pottery vessels, toast it in there, and then cook it directly after toasting it in that same vessel. Chiltepin, this is probably very similar to the wild ancestor of all chili peppers. Extremely delicious, about as hot as a habanero. Very easy to gather those and eat them. I like those a lot. And then I think this is the last one, which is the wild onion. There's a couple here. Yeah, this is Allium canadense, extremely common in the area. Very easy and beginner friendly to forage if you're interested. Just smell it. If it smells like onion, you've got onion. And these sessile bulblets are actually some of the best parts. And onions were extremely important for indigenous peoples throughout North America, eaten just everywhere throughout the continent. And extremely important in the diet, especially often eaten with red meat, like bison. And then this is our Allium jamondii, which is these are both native, but this one is the more arid adapted one. It's just a little bit smaller. And yeah, this is all the natives that were known in my research to eat onions and all different species. Okay, and that's it. Any questions? Yeah.
Just a suggestion, you want to show a photo of your pantry and your refrigerator.
Trust me, you don't want to see it. It's a mess. You should see my dining room table. It's just like this size and just piled up with all sorts of plant material and like mesquite and pecan, just like all this stuff in jars. And then above it, I got all these herbs hanging. It's a huge mess. And I also I have to fight with moths. These pantry moths are always trying to infest my stuff. So I'm constantly having to battle the moths. So don't want to see it. Sorry. Oh no, I do. That's the thing about the foraging stuff. Like I would say about depending on the season, about a fifth or a third of my diet is foraged food. I eat foraged food every single day, but you can only do so much as one person. All these practices, like the way I describe for acorn meal, it's a lot of labor and it's really only efficient if you have a bunch of people who know what they're doing to separate each step of that and doing it all together. And you don't have to have a job. That's just all you have to do. But there's a lot of stuff that I will forage. It's pretty efficient. It's a lot of fruits that I dry, a lot of nuts, and a lot of greens. Also, I preserve greens just by drying them. And I'll have them a lot of time, like a smoothie or my evening meal. Just throw whatever in there. Yeah. Uh, you want to know my special foraging spot? I don't think so. You almost got me there. I do have a little pins that I've put in my Google map that my particular areas because there's definitely particular spots that are better for certain species, but they're secret. Like my elderberry spot. What? No, these are just for me. I can't let anyone know my secret foraging spot. Like my Chickasaw plum spot.
It's his website with all of the upcoming foraging walks where you can sign in if you're interested.
Say something that people have a question about the walks.
Oh yeah, you go to paleoforaging.com there and booking. Oh, for foraging walks?
Yeah.
Yeah, for foraging walks, I have them at paleoforaging.com/booking. I have one coming up in Austin this weekend, but after that, there's some in San Antonio, San Marcos, Dallas, and Fort Worth, and I'll probably have more in the future. I'm always trying to list more.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.